So I've been at Kickstarter for 4 years now. Like I started there at a point where my job was to review pretty much every single design and tech project that came our way. And in the last few years, my role has evolved to leading the team that does outreach within the design and technology community. So what we do is we're out going to a lot of events, educating designers and engineers about how to run a Kickstarter project, advocating for Kickstarter or evangelizing for Kickstarter in those communities, and then advocating for the need of these communities within the walls of Kickstarter. So what I'm gonna, so really quick, I'm beyond working at Kickstarter. I am a Kickstarter addict. I've backed over 1,700 projects, including these pair of jeans, my bag, a few things in my bag. So I love working there and kind of being part of this ongoing process of launching films, books, products, comics, games. It's a pretty amazing and exciting opportunity and place to be there. And one of the things that through the lens of not only backing so many projects, but actually working hands-on with a lot of creators and reviewing thousands of projects, I've developed over the years a pretty good sense of what it takes what are some of the attributes of successful Kickstarter projects. And so today, what we're gonna go through essentially is these 4 things. I wanna talk about developing a plan to run a Kickstarter project, because that is such a core part of, when you see a Kickstarter project live, you often, you just see it for that, 1 month that it's live, but there's so much work that goes on in the months and months before that project goes live, and then in the months and years after a project wraps up. So I want to talk about developing the plan for your Kickstarter project, for your Kickstarter campaign, talking about actually developing an outline for your campaign story. Kickstarter, at its core, is a storytelling platform where if you tell a story that's compelling enough, people will actually pledge money to what you're doing and help bring it to life. But storytelling is a really core aspect of what you have to learn to do in order to have a successful Kickstarter. Then we'll talk a little bit about identifying assets to bring your story to life. And by assets, I mean creative assets like images, like films, potentially even events. What are these other things that you're going to do beyond just creating a narrative to help bring it to life? And the one final thing that's really crucial so you have this thing as a storytelling platform, but the other thing that Kickstarter really is a community platform. It's a platform where you engage a community of people that are, hopefully you engage these people well enough to begin with so they can back your project, but once they back your project, then all of a sudden you have all these people, hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people that you have to actively engage and manage in an ongoing way. So we'll talk a little bit about thinking strategically about your community. So today I'm going to talk about tools, and I'm not going to give you a recipe. There is no recipe. If anybody tells you that I'm going to tell you how to run a Kickstarter campaign, they are lying to you. There's no one right way. There's definitely, I think creators, when they do a successful campaign, they think well, not always, but often they think I figured it out. They've hit the ball out of the park, and then they think that they know what they're doing, which, to a certain extent, they clearly hit on they did some things right. But what's actually funny, what we find, is that a lot of times creators learn a lot more when they have a failed campaign than when they have a successful campaign. What's really, another grad from NYU, this team, and I'm now, of course, forgetting the name, they did these really awesome little robots, these tiny little robot creatures, and they did 2 projects on Kickstarter. Their first one kind of went viral. And it's funny because after they ran that first project, everybody was asking them for advice. They're like, how did you do that? Oh yeah, it was called Little Robot Friends. How did you do that? How did you, succeed? And they had advice to give, but, essentially that project went viral. When they did their second campaign, which failed, all of a sudden, it was so funny, they were saying how nobody asked them about tips for running a campaign after their campaign failed, but how they felt like they knew much more about what it takes to do a successful campaign after they had the failed campaign versus the successful campaign. Because the successful campaign was in many ways just a viral success, where people just found this thing cute and shared it all across the internet. But I think they had this kind of false assumption that a Kickstarter campaign, you just put something up there, and then it kind of does all the work by its own. If you're lucky enough to ever have a Kickstarter campaign like that, you are a very lucky person, but you should not expect that. It's a lot of hard work. So I want to talk about a few levers that you're going to use. This is like the first part of the presentation. I'm going to talk about like these levers that you have to succeed on Kickstarter. And so there's essentially 5 levers. The first lever is really up to you. That's something that you have to do on your own. We can't help you in any way, shape, or form, which is developing a product that people want. If you don't develop a product that people want, it doesn't matter what you do on Kickstarter, your campaign will not succeed. So that's kind of like, I call it the first level, but it's actually the foundation for what you're going to do. The next thing that you need to do is you need to build an engaged community. Kickstarter is a great place to build and to grow that community. If you have no community at all to begin with, you're probably going to struggle. Then the next lever that you have is your project page and the story that you tell and how you bring that to life. The fourth lever is just generating buzz, media, attention, just PR and communications. And then the fifth lever you have is driving pledges through targeted paid media. Today we're just going to focus on these 3 middle levers. The first one, I'm not the person to tell you how to develop an amazing product. And the last one, that's just something you can kind of learn a lot about elsewhere. Yes, do you have a question?
Can I ask questions?
Yeah, of course.
I was just curious, because some friends of mine actually are launching a Kickstarter campaign next week, I think.
Yep.
And they asked me today if they should try to get this buzz and media attention beforehand, or when the site is live, actually. What
Got
would
it.
you recommend?
So I'm just going to repeat your question because this is being recorded. Right. So you're asking essentially if when you're building buzz and generating interest, if you should start it before the project launches or if you should do it when the project has started. That's a really good question, and there isn't a super cut and dry answer. Considering that they're so close, in general, what I would say, broadening this question out a little bit, getting the word out to press is part of sharing about what you're doing with the world. And in general, we recommend for creators to start sharing what they're doing early on, because if you're like a company like Apple, it's easy for you to do this big announcement and you have all these people who are going to come and flock to hear you and they're going to write about it. But most startups don't have that kind of clout. They definitely don't have that kind of budget. So, starting early to engage influencers, press, and just prospective end users in a conversation about what they're doing is usually a good idea. And of course, again, talking generally, since they're now a week out, what they should definitely, because even if your goal is to just get press to write about what you're doing on the day that you launch, that involves reaching out to press before you launch, because it involves first actually trying to get the press person interested, to interact with you, to get on the phone with you, to hopefully have you be able to actually share with them your prototype and show them something working. So, all right, so now let's go through the first section that now we'll talk about. The next thing is as I said, planning the campaign. This is super crucial, and it's one of those things where the success of your campaign in many ways will be defined by how well you plan for it, and how prepared you are. Because once you launch your campaign, you're kind of in this insane sprint where there's just so many things happening, including your emotional state, which will be all ups and downs. And so if you didn't have stuff planned and you don't have kind of a set, whether it's set project updates, whether it's you've kind of prepared to do some kind of press outreach and you prepared some press releases and things like that, if you didn't do all that stuff before, you're going to be in a really tough place. So this project here that's been shown here, it's actually an ITP graduate. The reason why I put this picture here is this is actually the first Kickstarter product design project that went really big. This is kind of the project that, when Kickstarter was founded, it was originally a company that was started by a music journalist, an artist, and a designer. And their vision was really Kickstarter as a place for films, for music festivals, books. And only about a year and a half after it launched did somebody come and put a product up on Kickstarter, and all of a sudden they raised like close to $200,000. And then people were like, holy shit, I can come to Kickstarter to make products. And it was an NYU grad who did that. So that's pretty awesome. So when you think about planning months in advance, of course, beyond just planning your story, and like you need to actually make sure that you're ready from a product perspective. I mean, I don't know how many of you are actually working now on a product. I mean, as you know, that can take, depending on the complexity of your product, it can take months to years for you to prototype it and kind of get the feedback you need to really develop something that's compelling. You know, once you have a compelling prototype, actually to figure out what materials you're sourcing. If you're doing something with electronics, actually figure out your bill of materials, your BOM, and really understanding, making sure that your BOM, that those components are actually available, making sure that you understand who are, you know, like the partners that you're going to use, and even understanding, you know, partners where you're going to use if you're manufacturing 500 of something or 10,000 of something. So, you know, this, like once you have that proof of concept and once you have that engineering prototype, like it still takes really long time. You know, it can take 10 to 12 weeks. So you're talking about 3 months to build a really awesome Kickstarter page. It's not something that takes, like, if you try to hurry this and do it in like a month or in 3 weeks, I mean, yeah, can you put it together? You can, but chances are you're not going to be able to fine tune it. You're not going to be able to get like the copy really crisp. You're not going to be able to get like really awesome images. On the press angle, which what you had asked earlier, I mean, what we find is you know, and again, this all depends on the scale of project that you're going for. If you're trying to raise $100,000 or more, or if you're trying to raise $10,000, like that will definitely determine how long before you need to start planning. But you know, for projects that are ambitious, like we see them starting to plan their marketing and their press communications 8 weeks before. If you are going to get any support from a serious PR company, they will want to engage with you 10 weeks before, because they're going to want to work with you to 4 to 6 weeks to get a press release and to get your press strategy down, and then have 4 weeks before you launch to execute that. I'm not saying you should get a press, but just like if the professionals need that much time to get this done, if you're just learning how to do this, you also want to, and of course, as a startup, you can be more nimble, you can do things, but you know, it's, I think, a good frame of reference for you to understand the amount of work that goes into this. So, you know, this is another project from NYU grad, and you know, developing an awesome video, you know, like that takes you know, 6 to 8 weeks, unless of course if you have friends who are videographers and who really want to help you out, and they're willing to you know, work with you on weekends and really kind of try to get something quick, then that's great. But otherwise, you know, it is one of those things that it will require. Then again, to build a community, that's one that can take an undefined amount of time. And that doesn't mean it will take an undefined amount of time. That's one of those things, you know, that you only know how long it's going to take you to build a community once you start going out and talking to people, trying to get them excited about what you're doing. That's when you'll end up understanding. And when I say build a community, I'm not saying you have to build a community of thousands of people. If you have, I've worked with creators that had like 50 people in their community, but they were 50 people who were super passionate about the project, and some of them were influencers in that area. So that 50 people was more than enough to like help the project get traction when it launched. And I've worked with other creators that had email lists of 50,000 people, and that struggled to fund, because those were 50,000 people that they had collected over a period of 6 years. Most of those people didn't care about the project anymore. They hadn't been communicating with those people. So it was just kind of like probably most of those emails went to spam folders. So again, if you're manufacturing something, you know, to do a design for manufacturing process, that can take, you know, multiple months. And you know, one of the things to consider is also, you know, be very honest with yourself about how long it's going to take to finish your product after you're done. One of the things that we like, I think creators don't realize sometimes, is they're in a hurry to put things out there. But if you put things out there too early before you really understand what your cost structures are so that you can price your rewards properly, What you can end up doing is actually, for the short-term infusion of cash, you end up putting yourself in a situation where your long-term, like your startup's long-term potential is at risk, because either you underprice your product so that actually every reward that that was pledged for, you're actually losing money. So all of a sudden, the fact that you have 5,000 backers is actually a really shitty thing, because if you're losing $100 for each one of those backers, or if you're losing $50 for each of those people, like you're actually deep in the hole. So that's, again, like if you don't do that planning before, that can really happen. And this just kind of gives a general sense of like how a lot of these things kind of happen, how they relate to each other. You, of course, developing prototypes at the beginning, sourcing components, building project page, carrying out outreach. So this is just kind of to give a general sense of like the waterfall of how all these things go. And this is a quote that I really like about this, which is, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. And that's really important thing to keep in mind. And again, this is another view of just kind of getting a sense of like the structure of, like, I'll talk about each of these things now. Like what should be doing from 3 to 6 months from your launch, what should be doing 2 months out, 1 month out, 1 week out. So, 3 to 6 months from your launch, you're identifying the purpose of your campaign. You're researching past Kickstarter projects. You're starting to build a community. And this is, I can't stress enough, and Mark Barrows, which is this founder of this company called Moment, which they do these really awesome iPhone cases that with these really high quality lenses. He's like big on this wagon of like build, don't launch, which is this notion of like, when you're thinking about going to market and you're a small startup, you need to build that interest and not expect to like do this big flashy launch. Like, hey, look at me. I'm like, chances are people are not going to look at you. So you need to give yourself that time, build credibility with influencers, whether they're just people who are, in Mark's case, photographers. In your case, I don't know what that would be. 3 to 6 months out, you want to build a team, and building a team doesn't mean you hire people, but it means like understand like what are the resources you're going to need to have. Like you need to have somebody who's going to spend time working on the PR, on the community, and it might all be a group of 2 people that you're dividing between each other. But it's important to consider all those roles so that if you're less people, it will take you more time to do that work, just the 2 of you, or it becomes some things that there are agencies out there that sometimes get excited about working with startups and will work for free with startups. They're not. I mean, I know Sapient Nitro has this program in Boston, and they were starting a program like that here in New York. So sometimes like reaching out to people to see like, hey, are there people who are interested in either like we've seen creators also like connect with marketing students, communication students, like film students to like find people who could potentially help. So you can be really scrappy with this stuff, but you need to think about it early. 2 months out, this is where you're really creating storyboards. Like before you were just kind of figuring out a lot of these things. Now you're actually creating storyboards. You're actually planning your media outreach. You're actually continuing to build community, because that's the thing that's going to continue throughout the whole process, even after you launch and deliver a product. From a product development standpoint, you're still iterating through prototypes, developing your BOMs and your request for proposals if you're doing something that's a physical manufactured good, and you're starting at that point on your engineering prototypes. 1 month before you launch, at that point you're developing the copy and images for your project page. You're finalizing the rewards and your goals. You're starting to really activate press and influencers. From a product development perspective, at that point, hopefully you really do understand the cost of goods sold. You've determined the appropriate scale of manufacturing that you're going after. And if you want to be really successful, you shouldn't just assume that economies of scale will make your product cheaper to manufacture if you're trying to do 5,000 versus 10,000 versus 20,000, because there's sometimes huge gaps where you actually end up losing money because you have to pay for using a factory or tooling that's much more expensive at a bigger factory than the original factory that you planned to use that was smaller. And you're also now developing a more detailed production timeline. Then at 1 week out, you're submitting your product for review. You're building anticipation for your launch. So with your community, you're letting them know, like you're teasing them like, hey, next week. At this point, you're like telling them like, hey, next week at this time or this date I'm launching. The day before, you're like, hey, tomorrow morning at this time, get ready. And so you're kind of like doing like this drum beat. And then of course, on launch day, what we often see creators do is they'll do a soft launch to their community to get their community to be the first ones. Like they'll offer what they call early bird rewards, which is like a discounted rewards so that they get their community to be like, hey, come here first. You can take advantage of this. So let me take a quick break there. Any questions around? I know this is a lot of content because there is a lot to go through. All right, so everybody's awake still? Okay, good. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into building an outline and what that entails. And how many of you, I mean, are you all actually working on startups right now? Do you all actually have something? How many of you are doing physical products? Okay, most of you, but not all of you. And how many of you have actually, just to back up for a second, how many of you have backed Kickstarter projects before? Great, a good number, not all of you. Have any of you ever run a Kickstarter project before? No, okay, cool. I would say for anyone who's actually considering running a project, the first thing you should do is back a few projects, just even for $1, just to see, so you can kind of see what it means to be a backer, and you can see, because when you haven't backed a project, you might see the project page and you think that that's what a project is, but once you back it, you also realize that there are things like updates where a creator, sends these communications to their community, sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month, and it's nice to know, like it's good to back enough projects that you can see examples of creators who do it well and creators who don't do it well, because then you can understand how that can be a tool to keep people excited about what you're working on. So building an outline. So again, Kickstarter is essentially a storytelling platform. This is another NYU project. This is actually from the same, that team that did that first product design product ever on Kickstarter. They've actually run 6 Kickstarter projects now. They have a small design studio in Austin, Texas, and this was their second project. So the next slide I'm just gonna play for you guys. This is just like a short little video. This is just, this is a project that called Artiphone Instrument 1. And one of the things the reason why I like to share this video is because they do such a great job at actually showing what the product is by just starting with people playing with the product, trying it out, and reacting to it. And I think one of the core things, like when you're thinking about a Kickstarter project and the story you're telling is really about what you're creating. And so you need to, that is the core element of your story, and you need to make sure that you communicate that really clearly and that you don't bury the lead. You need to show people and get them excited about what you're making and why it's awesome right off the bat. You don't want to give them this whole other story, spend 2 minutes of your video talking about other stuff, or have the top of your project page being about your own personal story. Your personal story actually does matter on Kickstarter, but it matters as support to what you're creating, not as because ultimately, what we've built and what we are kind of really focused on building is a community of people who are excited about helping other people bring things to life. So the human aspect of the creator matters, but what really tends to resonate best is people getting excited about what you're actually making. There's these are kind of 3 core storytelling tools that you have on Kickstarter. You have your project video, which we just talked about it for a minute. You have your project page and you have your project updates. The way I like to think about these is that your project video is essentially telling people why you should care. It's like the hook. Most people will watch the video and they'll watch it for 30 seconds. So if the first 30 seconds of your video doesn't catch their attention, then chances are they're probably off to the next project page. But you're really hooking on them and telling them hey, I'm making this awesome thing, and showing it in a way that gets them excited about it. The project page is then once you've got them hooked, and it's oh, this is kind of cool. They'll actually then at that point either watch the full video or scroll through your project page. So that's where you want to tell them more. So if you're doing connected device, on the project page is where you're going to go into more details about that device. If you're doing like a design object, on the page you might talk about the materials you use. You might go into like details about that design. You know, if you're, I mean, just like the Brooklyn guys. You know, like I think, you know, throughout the page they were using these amazing like pictures and showing like Brooklyn in people's houses. You know, so that people could actually see and imagine that product in their own bed. You know, and then the updates are where you can explore more details. Like one of the things that's really interesting about like launching a product on Kickstarter is that, you know, you are actually having these people join you on a journey for like 6 to 8 months from the moment that they pledge to your campaign to the moment they have a product. I mean, ideally, if you do this really well, you're actually going to have people who want to continue to join your company on a journey for much longer than that. But it gives you this ability to, you know, actually build relationships with your early adopters, and that's a really powerful thing. I mean, I was just talking to a creator the other day, these guys who did this project called Point, which is this. I mean, it was originally created as like this sensor, this home sensor for people who have Airbnb homes, where like the way that it kind of keeps track of things going on in your house is through sound, so that like you don't have a video recording the person who's there, but it's like it tracks sound so that it can, you know, it can determine if there's fire, it can determine all these things, if there's a window broken, based on just tracking sound. And now that this team has a product in the market, and it's a product actually that they're having a lot of traction with big insurance companies, but they're still wanting to launch their future projects on Kickstarter because, like for them, it's like the amount of product improvements they were able to do through the direct like relationship they have with backers. I mean, it's kind of this constant feedback for them of like where they're constantly able to ask people like, you know, because these are, when you sell something at retail or when you sell something to other means, it's really hard for you to have that, like people then are only reaching out to you if they have a problem. You know, they're only reaching out to you to your support arm because they're having an issue with your product. Whereas this is an opportunity where, you know, you can actually have these people, you know, communicating with you throughout this journey and actually giving you feedback along the way. So, so now that we've kind of talked about those three kind of core storytelling features that you have, really spend 3 quick slides on how to build an outline for your story. So the first thing you want to do is identify like threads. Like what are some kind of story threads for the product that you're doing? I mean, this project is a project called Doppel, and it's a project where it actually gives you this haptic feedback, but the way that it's meant to be used is it will give you haptic feedback to keep you calm. So it will essentially like beat on your wrist like your heart rate to slow you, to like just physically give you this kind of reassuring sensation that can keep you calm. And so, you know, when they were thinking about their story, I mean, of course, the core thing at the center of it is the product and what it does. But then they had all these other parts of the story. I mean, they had an interesting inspiration story where it's like the team is really diverse. Like you have one of them is like a physicist, one is a designer, one is an engineer. And it's kind of like the story of how they came together, you know, through this collaboration between the Imperial College and the Royal College of Art in London. You know, they've done a lot of user testing with the products with these early ugly prototypes where they have all these awesome testimonials about people who are part of that process. You know, they have like the actual UX. I mean, that was actually a weak part of their story, so they didn't focus much on that. You know, they have use cases about different ways that they, you know, can see the technology being used. They have, you know, craftsmanship was a big thing because they developed these really, you know, for them, like they wanted the product to be really beautiful, and you know, like they really paid a lot of attention to the materials that were being used in the product. You know, they have, you know, again, the design, the science behind it. So, like for them, it was a process of mapping out like what are all these different threads of the story, and once they understood what those different threads are, that's when then you can start figuring out like how do you prioritize these threads? You know, like what are the core things that really matter? By and large, you know, UX, like the user experience, you know, and that's like tied closely together with what the product actually does and a person's experience with it. is going to be, for a product-focused campaign, one of the core threads. So you like that makes this part of the process easier. Like, you should always, what you're making and why it's awesome, and having people be able to envision that in their lives is a core thing you need to be able to do. So that's always that part of this chart will always be the same. But for the secondary thread, you really have to kind of think about which are the ones that are most compelling for your story. Because maybe your inspiration story is not that interesting, or maybe your technology is super simple, so it's not like that's not something you need to spend a lot of time talking about, or maybe design and the material selection is really crucial. Maybe you're doing something in a very sustainable way, so then like that part of your story is super important. And once you've kind of identified those, like you also need to think about like then you need to kind of like really map that out in terms of like within each thread, thinking about like what are the core messages within that thread. So MakerArm was this really awesome project where they were, it's like one of these mechanical arms that you can use as a 3D printer, you can use it as a laser engraver, but it's just a beautifully designed version of that. And so, this was some of the things, like for them, mapping out their, they had a thread, which one of them was just kind of thinking like, how do we introduce this to the world? They wanted, because it's like a beautifully designed thing, they wanted to introduce it with a little bit of character. And then, in terms of the multi-purpose tool, like, how, like, they were thinking about how to bring that to life. And the way that they brought that to life was really highlighting some specific applications that they thought were the most compelling, and actually talking about the interchangeable system that made it super easy to change heads. So I know that this process sounds really tedious, but it is really crucial, because otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time writing and rewriting and rewriting all this copy versus actually doing it in a way that's strategic. The next slide was, I think for designers this goes a long way, which is like, in design you always are sketching. You sketch your ideas. The sketching is a way for you to put your ideas out on paper and to iterate on it in a really fast way. And outlines is a similar thing for storytelling. It's a way for you to quickly put your ideas out there and iterate on the ideas before you spend the time trying to make copy that sounds nice, or try to create assets, like spend time taking pictures of things that you think are going to support a story that maybe the story doesn't make sense. So, I think just a few kind of things to consider. Again, reiterating some of the things we say, start with what you're making and why it matters. Celebrate the process and passion and people behind your project. Like people, on Kickstarter, people are not looking at this as just a store. Like they might actually want your product, but like the story behind it, the process, all these things can really, add a lot of value and can, get people to get excited about the project beyond, just, and also from our perspective, your project will not get featured if you treat your product as just a pre-sale campaign. If you bring in a little bit more about, this kind of the process. I mean, if you celebrate the creativity behind it, that's really crucial. Embrace transparency. I mean, one of the things that Kickstarter is, and this is, this can be very challenging for a lot of people. Kickstarter is a process of bringing a product to life in the open. If you're not willing to be open, look at the comments of certain, look for some of the biggest Kickstarter projects and go through the comments. You're going to see the level of transparency that backers require of creators. I mean, essentially, you're having people give you $50, $100, $300, trusting you based on a story that you told them, And so people are going to ask you a lot of questions. Sometimes, like, you have to be ready to be super honest about where you are in the production process. You don't want to tell people that you're ready for manufacturing if you're not really ready for manufacturing, if you're still like 3 steps away from that. People will call you out on it. People will get very angry at you if they feel like you've lied to them. It's a tough process. I mean, creators, when I work with people like who work at IDEO and these companies before, who are used to bringing products to life in this traditional sense, where it's like everything happens in closed doors and then all of a sudden you have a product ready for sale at a store, they sometimes really struggle with this because they want to treat their product as if it's ready for sale at a store when it's not. And then backers get really, sometimes they get really angry and like literally they go from like backers who are super excited about the idea to backers who are calling the creator a liar because they're not being open about about where they are in the process, and because the creator is not used to doing that, and so it's one of those things that you have to be ready to embrace, like radical transparency. If you and the more successful you become, the more important that is, because the quicker things can turn if people then start thinking like that you are not being honest, just to get money. So. So this is, Kano is a really, awesome computer learning, like coding kit. And, the creator from the Kano brought this up in a conversation, like really spend time locking down the story of what you're trying to do. Otherwise, their whole project is like, these guys are great storytellers. Like their whole coding platform is about storytelling. And so take that to heart. Any questions so far? All right. OK, let's continue. So another project from a NYU grad. This is a design studio from CWNT, Sayway and Taylor. They just like make everything from like apps to pens to big scale, like large scale installations to just like normal home products. And they just, I bring them up a lot because they just, it's interesting. They have these super beautifully taken photos, but their videos are super quirky and like almost like, oh, we're just shooting this video at home in our studio. So it's like I like how they kind of juxtapose these two kind of vibes in their campaigns, like how they, and it creates a really nice feel because it's not like, it doesn't go too over polished, because then they have these videos where it's like, very much just them in their studio talking about like, hey, we're creating this pen and like we think it's pretty cool. And but the videos and pictures are really important.
What was the name of the?
So you asked, the question was about what's the name of the creator, and Sayway and Taylor, and the way you write it. Well, if you look for CWNT, if you search for that on Google, you'll find them. That's their studio name. So, but thinking about images and videos to bring things to life, the first thing to consider is that prototype demos are required. Is anybody here working on an app? No, because apps, that's different. Like apps, we actually are a little bit more liberal, so that you don't have to have a prototype. I still would highly recommend that you have a prototype, because if you don't have a prototype, people are just not going to, like, I've never seen an app that has succeeded without a prototype, but it's not required by our rules. But if you're developing a hardware product, a physical product, any kind of physical product that needs to be manufactured and distributed, a prototype is required. This is the page where we have that talks about these requirements, but I'll quickly take you through. Beyond a prototype being required, because it's like the reason why we require a prototype is because it goes back to the transparency. We're requiring that creators are transparent about where they are in the development process. And that's why you need to show a prototype that shows like what is your working prototype. Like and that prototype needs to at least be able to show some core functionality. What I like about this project that they did is that, as much as you could look at the requirement for a prototype as like, oh my God, I have to do this, like this isn't something annoying, or you could look at it as a really important way for you to show the user experience. If you can't like demo a compelling prototype with your current, like if you can't do a compelling demo with your current prototype, you're too early to run a Kickstarter campaign. You should not be going and trying to raise money through Kickstarter. Like at that point, you should be working on getting your prototype so that people, when they play with it, interact with it, get excited. If somebody, because even then at that point, if you're able to somehow, luckily fund your campaign, you're going to have such a struggle. Like you're going to then be forced to shift into manufacturing mode before you're actually ready to, like you don't want to shift into manufacturing mode until you have a really compelling product that gets people really excited. And if you do a Kickstarter before you have that, and if by any chance you succeed, then all of a sudden, because of that pressure, you'll be forced to manufacture a shitty product, which it's going to be not just a lot of money, but probably a year or two of your lives that you could have spent actually hopefully bringing to life an awesome product. So User experience really matters. This product, as you can see, like what they had done, which was amazing. It's like this little speaker, and it's waterproof, and so they had one guy who was like taking the prototype and dumping it in water to show how it still worked. To talk about the sound, because how do you get people to understand the quality of sound of a speaker? Like they're not going to be able to hear it by listening to a video on their computer. So they actually had people who are sound engineers that they took the speaker to and had them talk about the experience. And of course, it's a tiny speaker. It's not going to have like mind-blowing sound, but the idea is like for the type of speaker it is, the sound's pretty good. So they had some sound engineers look at it. And then the other video, which is over there, it was just like they would, throughout the length of the project, they would get prototypes from the factory. They would get like a new engineering prototype, and they would do these unboxing videos where they would just be like, hey, this is the latest thing that we've seen from the factory. This is how things are progressing. So it just became like a great way for backers to follow along in that process and have confidence that things were moving along fast. This project here is like one of the reasons why I love this video is because it's like it shows an example of a video that's created by somebody not with professional videographers. These were the two creators. They spent a week with their families just shooting this video that kind of showed their prototype in action in all these like super fun ways. I mean the prototype even in the video looks a little janky, and so they still had work to do to make like the pretty version of it. But like the video did such a great job at like bringing to life what this is all about, and people got super excited about it, and they were able to raise money. But again, the prototype here didn't look great, but the video and the interaction was super compelling. So, and the other thing about sharing prototypes beyond kind of like actually showing it, like the final use, like the final user experience is really compelling, is that the process, again, I keep on reiterating this, the process of creating a product is compelling, and most people don't get to go through that process. I mean, you guys are all doing startups that are bringing a product to life, and you see the good and the bad of it, but most people never get a glimpse into this world, and supporting a campaign on Kickstarter is one of the ways that some people do get a glimpse into that world. I mean, this is a product from this New York-based creators who were developing a cast iron skillet, and I mean, in their video they show like all this work that they did, both building prototypes, but also just taking existing cast iron skillet and breaking them apart to like, understand, like to see, like to really investigate like what were some things that could be improved and so forth. Realistic renderings are not allowed on Kickstarter. So you can use renderings that are not realistic. Realistic renderings are not officially allowed. I mean, we are in a world nowadays where sometimes it's so hard to tell what's a realistic rendering and what's not. And so this is one of these battles that, I think in some ways it's a losing battle. I don't know. I think we're going to, at one point, have to adapt to this because, I mean, IKEA catalogs are 90% renderings, but you look at them and they look like real pictures. So, but, I mean, the intention behind this guideline is just making sure, again, transparency. We want to make sure that nobody sees a rendering of this beautiful device that doesn't really exist yet. This actually was a guideline that came about in like 2012 when this project called LifeX, which is a connected light bulb that you can buy nowadays out in the world. Well, they came to Kickstarter, and within I think 24 hours they had raised $1 million using renderings and not having a real prototype. And we were like, holy shit! Like, what? Like, do we know? Can these guys make this thing? Like, we had no clue. Like, dude. And I think after that we were like, we need like, and backers didn't understand that there was no prototype, because they had these beautiful renderings that looked, and so that was the point at which we were like, these are not products that are shrink wrapped and ready to ship, and so we would need to make sure that creators are not selling these products in a way that backers would think that they're sitting in somebody's warehouse and that they're, but again, I mean, there are things that you can do. I mean, renderings that are like blown apart like that, even if they look realistic, that's fine. Renderings where you put like a wireframe on top of them so that it makes it clear that it's a rendering, it's totally fine. When you're bringing a product to life, like show the product out in the world. You know, if it's like a watch, show people actually wearing the watch. You know, like people, like, you know, a lot of people have a hard time imagining. I mean, of course, you see like, I think what happens is a lot of people see the Apple like website and they see all these products floating in like air and they're like, oh, that looks beautiful. So I'm gonna aspire to that. But you know, Apple is Apple. I mean, people have seen the iPhones. They know like but when you're kind of doing, you know, a product that people haven't seen, you don't have the same level of credibility as Apple. You know, none of us do, unfortunately, when it comes to designing products. So actually show your product out in the world. I mean, this is this amazing product where this is actually live footage in real time. It's like this, almost like a piece of art that it actually makes objects look like they're moving in slow motion. It uses like this crazy combination of pulsating the object at a very high frequency and using strobe lights to like so that the dissonance between the phase of the vibration and the phase of the strobe light makes these objects look like they're floating in these kind of crazy. And again, it was one of those things where you know, the creator did an amazing job at showing this in different rooms so that people don't just look at this as this weird object that would like, but it's actually some magical thing that you can bring to your home. This is another, you know, example. And the Brooklyner also, I mean, that's another campaign that has great examples of that. And I think, you know, keep in mind that, you know, our community is really drawing to people and passion. So I know I talked a lot about product, but you know, show the inspiration behind it. You know, show the hard work that's gone on. Show some of the process that, you know, goes into creating what it is that you're creating. And it's okay to be yourself. You know, like I love this project. Like it's like these guys who and his wife who made these keyboards, and they're super like, you know, geeky, but in an amazing way. Like this is like their passion. And then their project page, they had all these like crazy, like very, you know, like authentic ways to show their kind of passion for this, for their work. So the last part of the talk now will just be a little bit about strategic outreach. So, you know, one of the things to consider when you're building a community, you know, Kickstarter is a point. It's going to be like, if you do a Kickstarter, it's going to be a part in your journey, you know, to bring a product to life. Building a community and media outreach is something that should go beyond Kickstarter. Like it's like you'll activate your community and you'll activate press relationships for Kickstarter, but in an ideal world, you know, your community is something that you're building for the long haul. You know, if you can build relationships with people in the press who cover the kind of work that you do or that your company does, that's not something like a short-term transactional thing. Ideally, those can be relationships that you can use, you know, 2 years down the road when you're releasing another product, or when you're, you know, or whatever other company story you have that you want to get out into the world. So here, though, you know, 5 steps to you know, start your outreach. Peak Design is one of the, you know, biggest Kickstarter success stories. They're this company that makes camera gear based in the Bay Area, and you know, so we're just gonna kind of act like, let's just assume that we were, you know, the guys from Peak Design. So, you know, the first thing that you know, you need to do is really kind of map out, like, what are the core communities and audiences that you have. Depending on your product, you might have just one core community. Other products might have multiple. I mean, knowing the guys from Peak Design, their core communities are professional photographers and adventure seekers. I mean, that's the guy who started Peak Design was a photography buff who loved to like travel and take pictures. You know, like he would travel to Thailand, all these places around the world, and he wanted gear to like take his camera with him in a way that it wouldn't, you know, if he's in the middle of the jungle, like he could strap his camera to his belt or something and it wouldn't fall. And so, you know, the 2 core audiences for them are, not that there's only 2, they might have more, but these are 2 of them. And then really kind of spend some time like, and think about, why is this audience, why would they be interested in this product? Like, what's the thing, like, where does their needs meet like our offering? Then think a little bit about, you know, how to reach that audience. You know, think about like, who are the people that you might want to reach that will help you connect with that audience. And people that could be, influencers. Like for them, this guy Trey Radcliffe, which is a pretty famous photographer, was somebody who also had the same passion. And early on, they were able to connect with him, and he's become kind of an advocate for theirs now for several years. But also, like, what are places? Places could be events. For them, photographer, there's PhotoPlus and Photokina, which are two, the biggest European and stateside photo events. And then think about publications. Like, what are publications that are writing about this? Whether they're blogs or whether they're actual magazines. Next, actually, go a little bit deeper and like, once you've kind of had the publications and like map out like, who are the actual journalists in those publications, and then really read the work of those journalists and at that level, not at the broad level, like, oh, this is a like a publication that covers photography. Like, actually go to the level, like, this journalist covers this specific type of photography. Like, he's written 3 pieces that are related to camera gear of this type. And just so you, like, what you actually want to do is be able to connect with these people as human beings and let them know that you actually understand what interests them and you understand why your product is relevant to them, when you're reaching out to press. And actually, you have to find their contact information, which luckily a lot of journalists don't. It's not that hard to find their contact information because they do want to be accessible. I mean, part of what their work is to be conduits to share about interesting things that are happening in their area of interest. And then develop a communication plan. Actually, think about like when you're launching and actually develop a calendar. Develop a calendar for like what are your target audiences, when are you going to communicate to them, and like what asset are you going to use? Are you going to write an email like there could be initially is just like if you're trying to reach press, you might want to plan 5 different touches, assuming that they're probably not going to get back to you on the first time you try to reach out to them. And then when you're planning those 5 different touches, you want to think about like what are the different things that I can bring up. Because it's important to think about these things strategically because then you can, think about this once and use it to connect with 10 people as opposed to like thinking about just every single person as one individual. Like you end up building out assets. So you build out like a message like why this matters to X person with X interests. And then you can find the 5 journalists with X interests and you can use that bit of copy or that video that you created or that image that you created. And then, once you develop this comms plan, that's going to have a bunch of like these requirements. Like you need a blurb that talks about X. You need a picture or video that shows Y. Then you actually develop an asset list where you kind of map out all of these assets that you need to create. The audiences that they're going to go to. It might be multiple audiences. The owner of who's going to create that. And a description of that. And so again, it's a pretty detailed process, and it's a pretty work-intensive process. But this is why planning months in advance is really important. So again, this is what I talked about earlier. This is that company Moment. They have a blog called Momentist. They just actually wrapped up a campaign a month ago or so. A great campaign, a great creator. This guy has written also a bunch of blog posts about how to do Kickstarter because he's run 3 projects. Definitely a really good person for you guys to read up about. If you are doing a hardware product, he actually runs a workshop called the Hardware Workshop that travels around the country, and it comes to New York, usually September or so. So it's like $75 for a 2-day workshop with some really high quality people leading the sessions. Like definitely worth attending if that's if you're working on that kind of product. This project, OSIC, one of the things that they did that was really amazing is that before they launched, they had their outreach plan was we want to have 1,000 people try our prototype. So they actually did a tour mostly around the West Coast where, for a few months before they launched, they went to maker spaces, schools, and all these places where they set up small events where they would, like their product is like this headphone with like 3D audio. And so a lot of the people who are their audience are gamers, people into VR. And so they just found places where those people congregate, like, and they just, invited them, like hosted little events where they, would give, beers and pizza. And they had, they knew that they had a product that was pretty awesome. And so that gave them this amazing, strong community. So when they launched, they had, a good number of those people who tried it actually were excited about the project. And we're not only backers on the first day, but also willing to share it. One of to the question earlier about press, like one of the things to consider is, as I've been pushing, you guys should, think about this as a building process, not as a launch process. But one of the things that's really important is when you think about this as a building process, you really need to think about how do you capture interest and how do you keep people engaged who raise their hands and say that they're interested. And that can be as simple as having like an email sign up, so that if you get some press written about you, that press has somewhere to send people where those people can actually sign up for an email newsletter. But the flip side of that is if you are actually getting people to sign up for an email newsletter, you have to make sure that you are actually sending an email newsletter, not talking to those people for 6 months or a year, and then all of a sudden expecting to send them an email and have them be excited about what you're doing. You have to find some way to be sending at least a monthly communication that gives people a little bit of update about what you're working on, And it's okay to be, to be a little bit not a little bit, to be informal. It's okay for that to be like, hey, it's me, the founder. The last month we've been, working on these prototypes. We've gone to these 2 events. We faced this challenge. It's okay to if people are really interested in what you're doing, they'll appreciate following along on that journey. And then if people get tired of it or they're no longer interested in your product, they'll unsubscribe from your list, which is actually really good because you don't want to have the false sense of security that you think 1,000 people care about what you're doing, but actually 500 of those people really don't are not interested at all anymore. And then just the last thing that I around this outreach thing that I wanted the last message I wanted to convey is that a lot of times you see these Kickstarter projects that blow up really big on the first day, and it looks like this happened all of a sudden. It looks like, oh my God, these people are so lucky. And sometimes it is that the product went viral. But by and large, the success on the first day is a sign of really hard work that's gone on beforehand, which is just not easy to see that work. I would say that 99% of products that are funded really quick early on is because of work that they've done for months and months in advance. So that's pretty much it. I know that was a lot of talking, so I'm going to hang out now. If anybody has any questions for the group that you want to ask openly, great. Otherwise, I'll hang out here for another 20 minutes, half hour, and happy to answer any questions one-on-one too. Please.
Have you found there's a best time of year or a best time of month or that to launch Kickstarter?
Absolutely. So the question is about timing. Is there a best time of year, month, week, day to launch a campaign? There is. I mean, Kickstarter is a little bit slower at the end of the year. So at the very end, like mid-December to mid-January. And in August, it slows down a little bit, not as much, but it does slow down a little bit. So I would say definitely unless you're doing something that's super seasonal and that makes sense to launch, to be live for that period between mid-December to mid-January, I would avoid launching during that period. And if for example, what we also recommend, if for whatever reason you have an event, let's say that happens in early December, and you want to launch at that event or around that event, what you can do is just have then a long campaign so that your campaign is starting in early December and goes all the way to late January. And the reason why I say that is because the beginning of your campaign and the end of your campaign tend to be the moments where you get the most interest. And that's both from your community, but also from press. There's a little bit more urgency. When you launch, it's it's new. So it's oh, it's something new, so people talk about it more. At the end, there's the urgency because it's about to end. So what we always recommend is you want to avoid having the launch or the end be at a moment where the activity is low on the site. So you'd also want to avoid having the launch or the end be right around 4th of July. Not that you need to avoid 4th of July to be in the middle of your campaign, but you don't want, or Thanksgiving, like you don't want to end or, so that's, I think, from time of year. I think other thing from time of year is if you have a project that's very seasonal, like if you're doing a product like a bike that people are going to use in the summer, or people are really thinking about that like spring, summer, that's when they get excited about that, you should launch it when people are thinking about that. Like, you know, we have some nice creators who are like, oh, I'm going to launch this product in the winter because then people will get it by the summer. But the fact is people in the winter are not thinking about how they want to be biking. You know, they're like thinking about other things. So it's better to actually, you know, like what we've seen the most successful bike projects are actually ones that run in time of year when people are actually biking. And I mean, we've seen successful ones in the fall too, but like in the winter is not the time. The same way, like, you know, if you're doing like some other summery thing, or if you're doing skis, like some like ski gear, you don't want to do that in the middle of the summer. It's not to say that it won't succeed, but like seasonality does matter. Like people are thinking that they want to back something when they're thinking about it in other points of their life. In terms of like within a month, there isn't like, it's not better to launch before like the beginning of the month or the end of the month. Within a week, we tend to find that the activity on Kickstarter kind of peaks around between Tuesday and Thursday, and then it kind of goes down a little bit over the weekend, and then it comes back up. So what we find is that most creators tend to launch around Monday or Tuesday, so that the first few days of their campaign, the activity on the site can be highest. It's not something that, like looking at the data, we can't see any clear correlations, launch date to success rate overall. So I think that's just more of a general practice, and I understand the rationale behind that practice. And so when creators ask me, like, should I launch on Monday or Tuesday? I'm like, the rationale feels like there's a reasonable reason, I guess, for doing that. But I can't say that we've crunched the numbers and that the numbers that we've crunched say that. In terms of time of day, like, in general, we do recommend that you launch in a time of day depending where your core audience is. If your core audience is in the US, in the East Coast through the West Coast, then you want to launch at a time, you don't want to launch in the middle of the night in the East Coast but if you creators who maybe have also a community in like China or Japan, or then it becomes a little harder. Like you want to find a time where ideally it's not like in the middle of the night for anyone, because remember, like when you launch your campaign, usually at that point you send that email to your people in your existing community. It's also like sometimes if you do a press embargo, like the press, if you're able to do that, if you get somebody who's interested in writing about your piece and they're willing to write when you launch, they usually want to write near your launch. They don't want to wait a day or two. I mean, the one caveat that I'll say there is that sometimes creators do that soft launch where they'll tell most people that they're launching the campaign at, like, let's say noon New York time, but they'll actually launch it at 9 in the morning and only tell like their friends and family that the campaign is live, so that their friends and family can take advantage of like the early bird rewards. And that's a strategy that we see used pretty often. You just want to make sure, like, you want to avoid from launching too much. Like that early bird period should be short and not like super long, both so that there's an urgency for people to get there soon, but also because otherwise, like especially on the press angle, like if a journalist thought that they were writing about your piece right when it launched, and then they find out that your thing already launched like 2 days before, they're going to be a little pissed and might not decide to write about it. So that's something to keep in mind. You're welcome. Any more? Please. No, please.
So I was wondering what legal steps you suggest creators and companies take before launching a Kickstarter campaign. Like, is it recommended that they incorporate? Should they have all of their IP documentation sorted out? I mean,
that's a tough. Like, there isn't a right answer for that. I think incorporating, like you do have to consider the tax liabilities of like having this come to your personal account. And I'm not like this is one of those things you should talk to an accountant about, like the tax reasons for incorporating. I mean, if you are really planning to start this as a business and this is a startup, then I think, you know, my personal advice is probably not for tax reasons or anything, but just like it probably makes sense for you to do that already. And there's even nowadays like there are programs like Stripe Atlas that help you incorporate in Delaware and make that process pretty easy, like much easier than sometimes trying to do that on your own. So, so I would say, like, from an incorporation perspective, if your goal is really to set up if you already have figured out, like, I'm creating a startup and I want to incorporate, then it's better to do that before rather than later having to deal with the implications of having to transfer your money from your personal account to the company account and dealing with all the tax and other complexities of doing that. In terms of like IP stuff, that's a really hard question, because IP stuff can, one, be like, you definitely have to be mindful of that and you have to be intentional about that, but that can be sometimes a long process, a really costly process, and I do think though, like, you need to consider that you're putting your idea out there for other people to see, you know, and you know, the same that you might be putting this out there through other means as well, but whatever time you're putting your idea out there for other people to see, there is the possibility that somebody will copy or mimic your idea. And so, you know, like, whether it makes sense to wait for 6 months or a year to do all you might need to do to protect that idea versus the traction that you might get, like, from being very timely, like, this is like shifting risk, you know, like, I think taking both approaches is and the right answer really will depend on what specifically you're working on your personal, like, preference. Like, that's a really one where there's no, I mean, I do suggest definitely talk to an IP lawyer about this stuff before. Know that they're always going to, as a lawyer, should tell you to take the most risk-averse way. So they're probably going to, so talk to, you know, you should, like, yeah, I think you just need to understand what is the real risk that you're taking there. And from the flip side, though, you should also consider any IPs that you might be breaking as well. You know, because sometimes creators will launch very fast without, like, considering, like, are they infringing on anybody's IP with what they're doing? And that, you know, I don't have any big horror stories around that. I've heard creators having to deal with that as an issue post-launch. The creators that I've talked to, it was more like an annoying thing that they had to deal with, but they were able to, like, work through that. Sometimes it was working through that with patent trolls. Other times it was actually legitimate other people who had, you know, some kind of IP related to the work that they were doing, and they were able to work it out pretty easy because the person wasn't trying to take advantage of them. They just legitimately had ownership of that IP. So, you know, you're welcome.